You are listening to the Uncle Tim Show on Vintage Radio, 107.7 WQUD, Erie Quad Cities. And right now, tonight, I'm both honored and excited to be joined on the air with retired Colonel Buz Carpenter, famously known for being one of the very, very few men to pilot an SR-71 Blackbird, one of the most amazing, impressive machines to ever fly. I was talking earlier that there's about 7.7 billion people in the world. 85 people flew the Blackbird, and not only did Buz fly the Blackbird, he was an instructor for the Blackbird, and it doesn't stop there. Buz has commanded squadrons. He's flown the U-2, the C-141 Starlifter, the RF-4 Phantom, and a lot of other jet aircraft. He's got about 4,400 flight hours in jets. He retired as a colonel, currently a docent at the Udvar-Hazy Center of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, Dulles Airport in Washington. You can find Buz on the Smithsonian Wall of Honor and in the Virginia Hall of Fame. But guess what, folks? Today, he is right here with us on the air. Welcome, Buz.
Well, Tim, I'm glad to be able to join you and your listening guests out there. It's fun. You know, the SR, the 6 years I was in the program, was quite a memorable part of my life, and I felt very blessed to have been successful in passing all the tests and being accepted into the program.
Can you tell us a little bit about just some general things, yourself, where you're from, family info, how you picked the Air Force, how you got into the SR-71?
Well, I grew up in Oakland, California, but my dad was an aeronautical engineer, did test work in World War II, and then he taught at the Brazilian Air Force Academy when they were standing it up. My godfather's an aeronautical engineer. Another uncle is an aeronautical engineer. So you kind of see a flavor there. So as I was growing up, I was around airplanes. I never flew before I got in the Air Force, but I think it was probably in the 50s. You used to go to the movie theater, and they used to have Movie Tone, and they used to have the news of the day. Well, this particular time I recall, it was the dedication of the Air Force Academy, and I just kind of thought, that would really be a great place to go. So that's kind of, and I looked at the different services, the type of airplanes they flew, and to me, the Air Force, because it is Air Force, flew some of the most exciting airplanes out there and had some of the most interesting missions, and that's what steered me to the Air Force. And after I graduated from high school, I had 2 years of college before being accepted into the Air Force Academy. I was in the 9th class. Back then, there wasn't a lot of information about it, and when my class entered, there were 840 some of us, I guess. 150 of us came from college because it just, and particularly where I came from, California, it was fairly competitive to try to get an appointment. So I was there. I played on a soccer team, went off to pilot training, and that's when I ended up out of pilot training, going to 141s, which actually was a little disappointment to start with, but actually it was a golden opportunity because the unit I was in flew worldwide. So I got to fly in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, into the Pacific, all the way down to Thailand. So it taught me a lot about flying. And I was lucky enough, developing my aviation skills, that I became one of the first lieutenant aircraft commanders flying 141s, which was their biggest transport at the time. So I volunteered for Vietnam. I went to RF-4 training. I flew RF-4s for 5 years, and it was in the RF-4 program that I met one of the early, I guess you can call him a pioneer. He was early in the program, then Colonel Jerry O'Malley, who eventually became General Jerry O'Malley, who flew the first operational mission in an SR-71. He got me interested in the program, but he told me I was too young. I needed closer to 2,000 flying hours, and you submitted to them your personnel record, your flight records, and your medical records. And then they did a review back in California, and if they found that, yeah, it looks like a pretty good candidate, they would bring you back, and you had a 2-day astronaut's physical you needed to pass, a whole series of interviews. You did some work in the simulator just to see some of your skills, and then you typically had 2 T-38 flights. That was our companion trainer in the SR with a current SR pilot to kind of assess how'd you fly an airplane. The SR is a very low-G airplane. If it's cold, you've not gone supersonic and heated it up, you're looking at 3.5 Gs, which is not a lot. For your listening audience, that's probably about what you get on some of the modern roller coasters. Not much more than that. And once you heat the airplane up, you're looking at 1.7 Gs, just because the airplane grows because of heating 3 to 4 inches in length, an inch or 2 in width, which means it's loosely put together, so you can't put much of a load on it. But I felt very blessed. It's a year training, and to be able to fly an airplane as remarkable as the SR-71.
You know, Buzz, I realized that I was so excited to have you on the air tonight there. When I first gave that little intro, I did not have my mic open to the public. I'm just going to interrupt and say that we are talking with retired Colonel Buz Carpenter. We're talking about the SR-71 Blackbird, and Buzz, just going to back up for a minute, has commanded squadrons, flown the U-2, the C-141 Starlifter, the RF-4 Phantom, has over 4,400 flight hours in jets, and you can find him on the Smithsonian Wall of Honor and in the Virginia Hall of Fame. And then the fact that we've got Buzz on the air here tonight, I am super honored and excited. We are going to get to the SR-71. I've got lots of questions. I know that you've got all the answers. I do have to have you talk about that Phantom just a little bit. Back in my Navy days, we called the Phantom the sexiest aircraft that the Navy was flying at the time. What did you think of the Phantom?
It was a great airplane. I had about 1,200 hours in the RF-4 that I flew in combat, and it was a great airplane, two-place airplane with 2 engines. I like airplanes with 2 engines, and it could take a lot of punishment. The Air Force, because they didn't have a fighter, basically adopted the Navy F-4 and modified it for our uses, not only as a reconnaissance airplane, the RF-4, but then as a series of F-4s. We had the F-4Cs, Ds, and later on, Tim, I would command an F-4E squadron. And one of the great things about an F-4E squadron, we had an internal Gatling gun. It wasn't a pod. It was actually part of the airplane. It was a wonderfully performing airplane. And I flew it for a few years, and then I converted the squadron to F-16s. And that's about the time I left and turned the squadron over to the incoming commander, who would have finish the transition to the F-16s that were being given to us.
Now, when you left there, is that when you got into the Blackbird?
No, when I left RF-4s, exactly. I was flying RF-4s out of Okinawa, Japan, and so I left there and went straight to Beale. When I was in the program, most of the time we only had 11 pilots that were active, and 11 navigators. When I was there, of the 11 of us, I would say 8 of us were F-4 or RF-4. There was one B-52 guy, one F-105 guy, and an F-106 guy. So you can kind of see the background. And then with the transition later, a B-52 guy came in and did a superb job. It helped. One thing they wanted was, when you came there, we didn't want to hire. We wanted multiple airplanes if possible, and we wanted refueling experience, because when you were going to be flying the SR-71, you were going to refuel on every mission. So it was much easier to teach somebody transition how to refuel an SR-71 versus how to teach somebody how to air refuel. That was a much more difficult task.
And we're going to get to that refueling. I know we're going to talk about your longest flight and how much refueling you did on that. But just basically, the SR-71, you gotta mention Kelly Johnson. You look up genius in the dictionary. Kelly's picture has to be there. The Skunk Works where the SR-71 was developed. When would you say the first SR-71 took to the air?
First time it took the air was in December of 1964, and that's with Bob Gilliland. There was a predecessor to it, a single seat, the A-12, but they decided that with all the things that a pilot had to do as a single seat, it made so much more sense to have two people that could share the mission. But also, the A-12 was mostly a photographic airplane, where the SRs, and it could carry about 2,500 pounds of sensors. The SR could carry 4,000 pounds of sensors, and it was what we call multiple intelligence. We had tremendous photo capability, but we also had radar capability, radar mapping to find targets on the ground. We also had a tremendous electronic survey system that could look out and pick up radars and transmitters and that within 320 miles of us, all around us. I mean, it was one of the greatest collectors of the time. And to give you an idea about the photography, here we are, you're at 85,000 feet, you're doing 2,100 miles an hour, 2,150, and there's people down on the ground in a parking lot, and they're holding a standard folder that many of your listening guests might have. If I flew over and took their picture and we processed the film, I could see all of them down there. I can't recognize their faces or that, but I could normally identify men and women. Children were a little harder. But back in the 70s when I flew these airplanes, about 70 to 80% of the time I could tell you what kind of a car you were driving.
From 85,000 feet.
From 85,000 feet at that speed. And now you see why 6 presidents used us, not only routinely, but called upon us during crisis situations. Because, one, they knew we'd come back. We never lost an airplane to combat conditions. And two, the information was so exquisite, it would really help them with their decision-making process. To give you an idea, during the Arab-Israeli War, 1973, 95% of the imagery that our Joint Chiefs of Staff, but more importantly, the President used to render decisions came from SR-71s.
Pretty incredible. Backing up to the presidents, we were talking off the air before we went on the air, and I mentioned the funeral today for George H.W., and you said you caught a little bit of that. You've met the president. I
most certainly have. He came out to Beale when he was head of the CIA, and what a wonderful person. He came in and very low-key just said, "Hi, guys, I'm George Bush. I head the CIA, and I task you guys on a lot of your missions. I want to see how this airplane flies." So I wasn't an instructor at that time. One of the instructors and one of the navigators put him in our simulator and flew him on a profile, because he had a pilot background. He was very interested in flying. So he spent over an hour in the simulator seeing how it all worked, because he'd come out to California to give a speech somewhere, but he wanted to stop at Beale and see this airplane that he, as the head of the CIA, would be tasking.
Incredible. I know that you've probably brushed shoulders with a lot of important people, a lot of interesting people. And going back, this Blackbird, I think I read somewhere where it was one of the last, maybe the last jet built using slide rule technology.
That's exactly right. Because, Tim, think about it. It was President Eisenhower that said he was appraised when the U-2 overflew Moscow. It's the only time it really overflew directly over Moscow, which was the 5th of July, 1956. They were surprised, because they didn't think the Russians would see it at 70,000 feet. And the second surprise was they could see surface-to-air missiles being deployed around Moscow, which the analysts felt could reach the U-2. So they assessed that the U-2 was vulnerable, and President Eisenhower approved every single mission. There were only 24 overflights. And so in 1958, they were looking for an aircraft replacement. 1959, Lockheed and Convair submitted proposals, and those were made up. I mean, they were figured out using slide rules. If your guests have seen a recent movie Hidden Figures, you see the same problem with the Mercury program, with John Glenn saying, I don't trust the computers. If Katherine Johnson hasn't verified my orbit, I don't think I'm going. Our young generation now thinks that we've always had a desktop or hand computers and everything else, but it was done manually with slide rules, and they were very accurate. About 15 years after the SR was built, they did a computer, basically put the airplane on a computer and said, if we'd had computers back then, would we have changed the airplane? And the answers came up no. There were some very minor, changes, but they wouldn't have affected the overall performance of the airplane.
Now, there is a credit to the people that built that plane. How much credit does Kelly Johnson deserve for the production of this plane?
He's the genius. I'm very happy. I love flying the SR-71 and your sense of satisfaction. But I'm here to tell you, I also treasure. I had 3 or 4 times when I was one-on-one with Kelly Johnson, and remarkable guy. He had a lot of respect for crew members, but he was a tough taskmaster. The first time I ever met him, I was a captain. I hadn't even started my SR training. I came down. The wing commander had me come down with him down to Burbank and meet Kelly. And all of a sudden, the wing commander leaves the room, and I'm in there with Kelly, and he talks a little bit, and then he kind of looks at me with kind of pointing a finger a little bit and says, Captain, everything on this airplane's recorded, and I've enjoyed my conversation with you today, but if you don't follow the check orders, the next time you're here in the office with me will not be quite as pleasant. And you talk about being intimidated, but I had the opportunity later on, and if you came back from a flight, Tim, and there was a note in your
inbox
closet, per se, and you've taken off your spacesuit, and it says, call Kelly, you needed no permission. You called down to Burbank, you said, okay, what time and what telephone? It'd be a secure phone, and he was cleared for anything we did. We'll talk later about the mission into the Middle East that I flew for President Carter, but as soon as I returned back to the States, there was an immediate request for me to contact Kelly and talk to him about a couple things.
Boy, you can't have too many Kelly Johnsons out there. The development of the SR-71, it was all innovations. Is that correct? I mean, you had to invent everything.
Kelly had the genius that when he realized what President Eisenhower wanted, these were the 3 things. He wanted an airplane that didn't fly at 450 miles an hour, that flew at 2,150, not at 70,000 feet, but at 85,000 feet and above, and he wanted America's first stealthy airplane. President Eisenhower's number 1 priority, and it's in Kelly's notes, I want an airplane that Khrushchev can't see, because he felt that if an airplane was shot down, this was before the U-2 was shot down, that Khrushchev could feel that the overflight was an act of war. So he wanted an airplane. So you end up with America's first stealthy airplane. And now it's not stealthy by today's standards, but by the standards of the 70s and into the early 80s until we finally get the F-117. It was a stealthy airplane. And if you turned off your transponder over the United States, most of the time the air traffic control would lose contact with you.
Who didn't realize you were there. Well, to meet those specs, first of all, you had to have an airframe that could withstand that speed and the temperatures. So first problem that I was reading about is you got to build it out of titanium, and we don't have titanium.
That's right. And this is the genius of Kelly, because he could map out in his brain, if you're going to build a plane like that, these are the factors you're going to have to overcome. And he surrounded himself with great people, and he gave them the responsibility for subsets that would come together. And they realized that, like you said, it's got to be made of titanium at the kind of heats we're going to be dealing with. So the CIA set up a frontal organization in Europe, and we bought titanium from the Soviet Union to build 32 airplanes, and they never knew what the titanium was for. All they wanted was the money for their economy.
So that's how they sourced all the titanium. The engines, another a miracle.
Those Pratt Whitney, those engines. If some of your guests know how the numbering system works, even numbered engines are Navy engines. So when you say the J-58, you go, now why is that an Air Force airplane? Well, it turns out the Navy had a special program that they were trying to make the Crusader go faster in a dash capability. Well, the engine weighs 6,000 pounds, and you really couldn't take it off and land it on an aircraft carrier. So it was never used for the Navy. But as Kelly and his team are looking around for a propulsion system, they come across the J-58, and then they go through a process. Bob Abernathy was the project. Imagine, in today's standards, Bob Abernathy was given the responsibility by Pratt & Whitney to work with Kelly Johnson's team and obviously the Pratt team when he was 26 or 27 years old. And he came up with some ideas. Matter of fact, twice they were rejected because if you think about Mach 3 plus, the air, as you're compressing it, the air is very cold up there, minus 80, but as you compress it into the engine, you're now looking, the mechanical compression, it enters the first stage compressor at 800 degrees because of this compression. You know, many engines, that's the temperature you're pumping out the back.
Right.
So now you're going to run it through the engine. So obviously the engine's going to expand, but we didn't have accurate modeling back there. So it was Bob pretty quickly determined, said, you know, when we get up to these kind of speeds, we got too much air in the front. It's backing up because it can't get through the compressors fast enough. And that 3,400 degrees in the afterburner is melting the tail off the engine because there's not enough air back there. So he twice submitted it and was twice rejected. Well, they lost some engines on test pads and stuff like that. Imagine the way they tested this engine in West Palm Beach, Florida, Tim. They ran a J-75 engine in front of the J-58 engine because that accelerated the air to kind of replicate the high speed and heated it. So you now have exhaust, hot air coming out of a J-75 going directly into a J-58 to do the test. Well, there were some engines that didn't survive, so they finally agreed to it. And out of it, there's 4 patents, of which Bob has. Originally, they didn't think it was. They said it's worthwhile to try it, but they didn't think it'd make that big a difference to the performance of the engine. Well, what it did, it increased the thrust by 50%, reduced the fuel flow by over 20%. So you basically have a hybrid ramjet at high speed. When we were at 3.2 Mach, 82% of the air was not going into the core of the engine. It was going around in 6 bypass tubes. So it comes out of the 4th-stage compressor, bypasses the engine, goes back in the afterburner and does 2 things. One, it adds critical additional cooling, which was needed. And the second thing was, you're an afterburner, so there's raw fuel back there that needs more air to burn to be effective. There are so many incredible innovations. I mean, Kelly basically said, I had to almost invent everything you can imagine to make this airplane fly. If your guests Google the SR-71, they can Google me, and they can see some of the briefings, but I'd ask them to take a look at the cockpit. It's a typical early 60s cockpit, because one of the things, and with additional, obviously, controls and switches and things for the supersonic, since we're going to cruise there, but one of the things Kelly said, I've got so many problems on this airplane the cockpit works, we're not going to mess with it. So that's part of the reason it took us a year to train you, because it's an old round dial analog cockpit that we had to fly with.
He was too busy inventing other things. I mean, once he got these engines working, they had to come up with a new fuel that these would burn. It's JP7, correct?
JP7, exactly. Normal jet fuel that is burned normally ignites at about minus 40 degrees. So electric ignition in jet engine lights it very nicely. JP7, you've got to get it above 335. So what we had, because it's a very stable fuel at high temperatures, what you have is a chemical ignition. So each engine has a tank on it filled with triethylene borane. We called it TEB for short. And what happens when you go to start the engine, a shot of this TEB comes in at about 1,000 RPM, and it explodes when it hits the air at 3,000 degrees. So it very nicely lights the fuel. And once JP7 is going, it's a wonderful fuel. And then the same thing when you light the afterburner. As you light the afterburner, a shot of this chemical goes into the afterburner area to make sure that you get a clean light on the fuel. And you're reading a lot, your guess about the hypersonic vehicles that are being tested by a number of countries, ourselves included. If you read the reports, you'll see that the fuel they're using is JP7, because you're talking about a vehicle they're going to try to get up around Mach 6. So you're going to have a very hot vehicle flying, so you need a fuel like JP7 that's very stable and be able to deal with those high temperatures.
I had always heard that you could throw a match in JP7 and the fuel would put it out.
Yeah, you're not going to get it to light.
Amazing.
In fact, you could probably put a blowtorch at it momentarily and or for a minute or so, and it wouldn't react. You've got to get it. It's got to be ignited under the right conditions at high temperature.
Triethyl borane. You don't just go down to the grocery store and pick that up.
No.
My sister actually works for a chemical company that produces that. A lot of rocket companies use that. The fuel, the plane leaked on the pad. Is that right?
It leaked throughout, all on the ground, in flight, everywhere. Because of the heating on the airplane, the average temperature of the airplane is over 600 degrees, and it grows 3 to 4 inches in length, an inch or two in width. So in a traditional airplane, you put in rubber fuel bladders to contain your fuel. Well, a rubber fuel bladder can't withstand 600 degrees. So what they did, they made the tanks as tight as they could, and then they tried to seal them with silicone. Well, it might work for a flight or two, but as the tanks heated up, as the fuel was burned off and the tanks were exposed to the direct heat of the airplane, the silicone would become embrittled. And so the fuel would start leaking. But there was really no fire hazard. My wife was actually around this airplane, Tim, before I was, overseas. It's a long story. I won't bore your guests
but it's a funny
tonight.
But it's a funny story.
It's a funny story because she went over and she convinced the wing commander, who would later recommend me for hiring, that she could bring 9 of her lady friends. So he told them, well, don't wear good shoes because the JP7 will attack shoes, which it did. But she came back and she was all flustered and she said, pull your volunteer statement. It's the most dangerous thing I've ever seen. They're wearing raincoats working underneath the airplane. Every 100 hours, the airplanes, all the tanks had to be opened and stripped of the silicone and then fresh silicone put in there. But it was not uncommon underneath the airplane when maintenance was prepping it for flight. There'd be all these drip pans all over, and fuel would be dripping out everywhere. But like I said, like you mentioned, there's no fire hazard associated with it.
It's once it got up there around 85,000 feet, things sealed up pretty good. I'm reading that the oil was at solid at 32 degrees. It was jello at 40 degrees. I mean, it took a lot of heat just to get the oil flowing.
before we could start the engines, we had to see 70 degrees on the temperature gauge because we had to make sure that the oil was in fact fluid to give the lubrication the engines needed as we started them up.
And this bird got so hot. Tell the folks out there what you ate on the long missions. What do you think? What was the longest mission ever performed in an SR-71?
Longest mission was 11 hours and 20-some minutes, and that was from the East Coast of the United States all the way into the Middle East and back during the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. None of the European countries would let us fly out of Europe and back because they were afraid of an oil embargo. So we were forced to fly from the East Coast of the United States, and I'm happy to say there was never an abort. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it was the photography from the SR-71s that the president used to render his decision on how to support Israel during this particular war. Those missions were anywhere from 5 to 6 refuelings. Every 2 hours, you had to come down from 85,000 feet and come down, and you had dedicated tankers. Typically, we like to find them at 25,000 feet. That was a good refueling altitude for us. And they had these were called Q models. They were specially built tankers that had a special tank in the middle of the aircraft that they could isolate. And in that tank, they would put JP7 because we didn't burn JP4 because it was too volatile. So when we came up to refuel, they would pump fuel from that special center tank. That's how they would refuel us. Now, they could burn 7. When they were cruising, it was okay because once the engine's running, but the problem was if for some reason they lost an engine and then tried to restart it, even with a hot engine, the electric ignition probably would not relight the JP7.
It couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
They call the SR-71. Tell us about the nickname.
The Habu. When the Blackbirds came to Okinawa, the Okinawans have a Cobra, and they call it, the Japanese for it as a Habu. Well, when the SR takes off, imagine you release brakes, and in 20 seconds you will have gone 4,500 feet. You're lifting off doing 240 miles an hour. That's in 20 seconds. You're going to cross through 20,000 feet less than 2 minutes from the time you release the brakes. So think of what the SR looks like as the nose comes up and you're climbing rapidly. You're going to climb 20,000 feet less than 2 minutes. You look like a cobra. So the Okinawans gave it the nickname Habu.
The Habu.
The Air Force never named it. You know, most airplanes like the F-16 was a Fighting Falcon. The F-15 was the Eagle. All the airplanes have names, except the SR never got a name, or the U-2. The U-2's just called the guys and gals nicknames it the Dragon Lady, but the Air Force never gave it a name. They just call it the Blackbird.
But Blackbird was pretty common.
Yes, that's how most people know it. If you say Habu, and the significance of the Habu is that if you saw crew members, not on the pressure suits, the Gemini suits or the follow-on suits, but on the suits that we wore around the base and we flew in the T-38, there was a Habu patch. And the Habu patch basically to the community said, okay, that person has flown an operational mission in the SR-71.
Well, you just mentioned suits, and I know that they were incredibly expensive, incredibly technical. I believe they even used them in the space program.
They did. My first 2 years there, I had a pair of Gemini suits. That was the suit that had been modified for our needs. But, that was really designed for the astronauts, and the astronauts didn't do as much in a Mercury or Gemini capsule as we were required to fly the airplane. So a new suit was developed, didn't have a sexy name, was just called the 1030 suit, but it had more shoulder flexibility, the air conditioning was better, and it fit better. Came in 12 sizes, and it was adjustable. We each had two of them. They were $250,000 a piece because that included the helmet and the oxygen regulator and that. But
$250,000 in the 70s.
$250,000 in the 70s, and today they're making more of them, so there's still $250,000. Think about that.
Yeah.
But when the space shuttle astronauts had to do the first 4 test missions in Columbia, as you mentioned, they didn't have their own spacesuits, so they borrowed. They never returned them. They took 8 SR 1030 suits, and that's what they used. The disadvantage is we could not get into the suit by ourselves. There was things that we couldn't do. We could get out of the suit by ourselves. So those test astronauts, that each of them took up Columbia for just short of 2 days, so they got to spend 2 days in their pressure suits, which my longest time in the pressure suit was 13 hours. And I was glad to give the suit back to my technicians for the post flight. I have over 1,000 hours in space suits. You get used to them after a while. That's just your work. That's just your work outfit.
How many missions did you fly in the SR-71?
I flew about 65 plus operational missions, and I think I had about 225 total flights for 777 hours.
Can we touch on your longest flight and then your favorite flight?
You bet. My longest flight was a quick reaction. When you flew for the first time as a young crew together, you then had to throw a party for the rest of the squadron and the staff. So this is Saturday night. We're having a party. And there's just something in the background. You can kind of sense it. Something's going on. And at about, 9 o'clock at night, the head of operations, a colonel, comes over to me and says, Buzz, when you're through at church tomorrow morning, bring your navigator down and come up to the vault. We need to have you look at a mission and review it. Tim, at 7 in the morning, I got a call that says, get your navigator now and get down here. So we went straight down there and we looked. It was the Middle East, and by noontime, I called my wife. I said I'll be home to pick up my bag, and I'll be gone shortly thereafter. Well, my navigator and I left about 5:30 in the afternoon on a tanker. We were a relatively younger crew at that point, and one of the senior crews, and may have been the most senior crew, flew the airplane over, which was Rich Graham and Don Emmons, about a 4-hour flight. And the idea was this package for President Carter. There was a conflict taking place in the Arabian Peninsula between Yemen and other forces. That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's going to be 3 missions. So Rich doesn't like longer missions. The French wouldn't let us overfly, so we had to go around Portugal and Spain. So it was going to be 5 refuelings, 9 hours and 45 minutes. So Rich came to me and said, I tell you what, I'll bring the airplane over. You fly the first mission. I'll fly the second mission. You fly the third mission, and then I'll take the airplane home if it all works out. Well, I'm the junior crew. I said, sure, whatever you... So we went through a series of things. The first mission was delayed 2 nights in a row because of dust storms in the Middle East, so the White House is getting antsy. We finally take off, and lo and behold, we get all the targets that are needed. So there never was a second mission, and so the big joke even to this day said, okay, the senior crew brings over the airplane for the junior crew to fly it for the president, and then the senior crew takes the airplane home. There's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah, something wrong there.
But President Carter, being of his nature, I mean, I don't think he had any idea who I was. I never had any contact with him. But imagine you're flying a mission, and you know that the president is actually monitoring this flight from the Oval Office. because they needed the data to see what was going on. And you think back, this was March 1979. Our satellites really didn't cover the Middle East very well. So they were dependent on the SR to bring back the imagery, particularly in a hostile situation like this, so they could figure out what to do.
You got to use those cameras.
Now, you were asking about the longest mission. My longest mission was a little bit similar, but it was out of Beale Air Force Base, and it may have been the only time we ever did this. It was to survey the submarines in Murmansk. So we actually took off from Beale at about 10 o'clock at night. And
that's California.
California had a series of, over Utah and Montana, did my first refueling with 3 tankers, because we're always afraid that one of the tankers might not be able to pass fuel or we'd have a problem. So they always, particularly a high value mission, because there was going to be another SR take off an hour after me. So if I had any problems, I would turn around and they would take the mission. So I refueled there. My second refueling was over Goose Bay, Labrador. 3 more tankers came up, and that's when I made the call that I'm ops okay, and I proceeded. The airplane that was behind me then flew a training sortie and landed for an open house up in Washington. My third refueling was tankers that came out of England. There were 3 of them north of the Arctic Circle, well north of the north edge of Norway. They refueled me. Then I flew along the north coast. We never overflew Russia, but because of our navigation system, which I'll talk about in a minute, we flew the closest of any of our airplanes. So we sat right on their international border. And with that, Tim, with the radar, I could look 100 miles in, and we could do mapping over there. With the optical cameras, we could look about 25, maybe 30 miles in. And electronically, like I'd mentioned, we could pick up any transmitters or radios within 320 miles. So we flew the mission. There was another set of tankers that refueled us north of Norway, 5 more. I flew across the Atlantic. The 3 tankers that had refueled me in the morning had landed. They had refueled. They were back up in the air. They refueled me, and I flew back to California. So when I landed, the mission was 10 hours and 20 minutes long. We'd gone over 14,000 miles and consumed something over 72,000 gallons of fuel.
That is a lot of fuel. I can't imagine the logistics just in the tankers on a mission like that.
The tankers, when people ask, were the tankers important? Without the tankers, the SR-71 wouldn't even be probably remembered today, other than maybe it set a speed record. Because every 2 hours, we had to come down from 85,000 feet and be refueled by these dedicated tankers, and they were wonderful. In the history of the program, I've been told we had over 26,000 refuelings, and I am not aware of any time that we didn't have tankers when we needed them.
I was going to just say, with a full load of fuel at Mach 3, how long would it take you to empty that aircraft?
Well, it was 2 hours. By
2 hours.
You came off the tanker, and you lit the afterburners. It took you 17 minutes to climb back up to 85,000 feet and accelerate, because you're going to climb 60,000 feet and go from about 450 miles an hour to 2,150 miles an hour. It's the only airplane I know that can climb and accelerate at the same time.
Yeah, there's an amazing fact right there. Back to that favorite flight that you did for Carter. Can you touch on the cameras in the film? That kind of blew me away.
We carried what's called the Country's camera. It was an optical bar camera, and most of the people are going to say, what's an optical bar? It's a spinning mirror type of thing. But what they need to focus on is that each picture was 72 miles wide. So in a little over an hour over the Arabian Peninsula, John Murphy, my backseater, and I, with the camera on, filmed over 100,000 square miles of where this conflict was taking place. But imagine you come back They download this camera. The camera film is 5 inches wide, and each negative is 68 inches long. But the total film is 2 miles long.
Wow.
So you take it into the dark room, and you've got technicians in there with cotton surgical gloves, and they cut the film into 500-foot lengths. And then with their hands, they go the whole length of the film to make sure there's no cuts or tears. Because, excuse me, the last thing you don't want to do is put the target film that you want to look at into a film processor and have it jam. So if you're going to lose some film, you want to lose just small sections of it. You don't want to have a big, disaster per se. And that's why they cut it into the smaller sections.
When a president's waiting to see it, those film technicians, they're under a little bit of pressure there.
And I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit, but this is a good time, Tim, to bring up 9 hours and 45 minutes. I land back at Mildenhall. You've got a president waiting for this information. They download the cameras. They download the recorders with all the electronic signature of the Middle East that we could see. They put it in a waiting airplane, fly it across the Atlantic, process it in one of our processing centers here in Washington, D.C., and then deliver it to the president. What does that tell you? That from the time we collected the information, it's probably a minimum of 24 hours later before President Carter saw it, and it could have been a lot longer.
Yeah.
I think this fact was probably one of the main reasons in 1990 when the decision was rendered. One, the Cold War had come to an end, so they thought it was going to be a more peaceful world. And it was $85,000 an hour at that point because the airplane did take a lot of maintenance and all the special fuels and our tanker fleet and all the processing.
What was that figure, Buzz? Excuse me for interrupting. That $85,000 figure.
$85,000 an hour to operate the airplane.
Wow.
But I think the most telling factor was we never developed a data link. And by that time, the U-2, even though it couldn't fly in hostile areas, as it was collecting the information, it was almost immediately being delivered to the decision makers.
Right.
And that's the world we live in today.
That's what brought the program to a close?
I think so. I think that was probably the biggest determinant. There were some politics involved, too. I think because at that point, we had one trainer and we had 10 airplanes. And when I say we actually had more, at that point, when we built 32 airplanes, we lost 12 of them. And a part of that was when you build an airplane with a slide rule, there's no modeling and simulation. You, the test pilot, have to go out and incrementally go faster and try new things, and some of the things didn't work. Fortunately, the airplane had a magnificent rocket ejection seat, so there was only one SR fatality, and that was a Lockheed test engineer, unfortunately. They were trying something new, and the airplane had an aerodynamic disturbance, and the airplane broke up in flight over New Mexico. They were at 82,000 feet at 3.12 Mach. If you've ever seen the tale told by Bill Weaver, the airplane literally came apart around him.
Wow. 32 built. None were brought down by hostile forces. That's
correct. That's exactly correct.
How many times did missiles get shot at the SR-71?
At least 100, maybe more. Ben Rich used to say there was 4,000. That's a very bogus figure. But fighters used to come up all the time. We would see their contrails, and we'd see them attempting to intercept us. But, when you're flying at 85,000 feet, you're the fastest airplane in the world, and you're stealthy, we're a very difficult target.
Yeah, I would say so. What kind of records does the SR-71 hold? I think it holds everything.
Yeah, I was there when 42 years ago at Beale when we set the speed record, 2,193 miles an hour. And what you have to know is it was a 10-kilometer course. Algiers and G.T. Morgan was the navigator over Edwards Air Force Base. The first pass, because you flew one direction, turned around, flew it back, and then they averaged the two speeds. Well, going the first direction, the airplane performed perfectly. When they turned around, they had an engine problem, inlet problem. So the top speed in the airplane is probably, I would easily say, it's faster than that. But that's a record because it was measured by the French team, exactly. So 2,193 miles an hour is the world record for a manned air-powered airplane per se. The navigation system I want to talk about, it came from England, and truly remarkable, because when you're traveling at 35 miles a minute, you're not going to be going tack end to tack in or doing the traditional thing. So what they came up with, the British did, it was the first automated system tied to an inertial that basically navigated off the stars. Because when you're at 85,000 feet, the sky above you is black. There's no clouds up there to speak of. So we had star catalogs, and we guaranteed the president, this is long before GPS, 300 feet anywhere in the world traveling at 2,200 miles an hour.
This is Star Wars technology, and so how did you acquire these stars? I mean, is there a camera on the
There's a special sensor in the top of the airplane just forward of the air refueling. And when we pulled out of the hangar on a sunny day, the technicians came down about 2 hours before we were going to start engines. And they loaded all this data in the master computer on the airplane, loaded the positions of the stars, loaded all this information, the route we were going to fly, the pictures we were going to take, everything that was on there. We'd start the engines up, do the tests. As we pulled out of the hangar on a sunny day, within 2 minutes, this sensor did not see the blue sky. It just looked through the blue sky and would lock on the stars. And within 2 to 3 minutes, routinely, it would reconfirm our position on the face of the Earth. It was an absolutely amazing system.
It sounds like it. Slide rules and stars. You don't need all the modern stuff to produce an amazing machine like this. One that I do put right up there with, I put the SR-71 right up there with the Hubble Space Telescope and the Space Shuttle. This just the technology.
Well, many people say that, the Apollo program, the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, its parallel was the SR program because of the technologies that had to be developed to meet the requirement that President Eisenhower had laid out there. Truly demanding. Now, one of the things your guests had probably, at one time or another, turned on the television to watch a space shuttle coming back when we were still doing our space shuttles. If you look at the shape of the space shuttle is the perfect lifting body developed. But if you look at the shape of an SR, it looks very much the same. Well, the SR is the first lifting body. The forward body of the SR-71 at speed produces 35% of our lift, which allowed Kelly to fly at a higher altitude and do steeper bank turns. So a lot of what we learned from the SR then went into the flying bathtub program, the lifting bodies, and then you created the space shuttle. But one of the things that the space shuttle and the SR-71 share in common is the sonic boom. Because of the shape of the airplane, we have this double, it's a boom-boom, as the shocks pass over the ground, and we have no control over it. It's always going to be there. But I know my guests, when I do tours out at the museum, are amazed when I tell them, sometimes we were tasked by the State Department to overfly heads of state when they were greeting each other and purposely boom them to send a message that they were doing things counter to U.S. policy.
Oh, just a little warning.
Just a little warning. The 3 nights before we invaded Panama to get rid of Noriega, SR-71s overflew Panama to kind of say, I think it's a good time to leave because the Marines will probably be not too far behind us.
I like that subtle warning. Backing up to just a couple other questions about the aircraft itself. The cockpit glass, how thick was that?
The glass, it's a quartz glass, similar to what you have in your oven. It's about 3/4 to an inch thick, and my forward window in the airplane was 620 degrees. My side window was about 560. So even in your air-conditioned spacesuit, you could only hold your hand against the glass for 5 or 10 seconds, and then it was too hot. Now, we're in a suit, so people sometimes ask me, how hot was the cockpit? We think the cockpit was between 70 to 80 degrees. And we measure that because when we grab switches or things in the cockpit, they were neither hot nor cold to the feel. And you can know in your spacesuit, when you go to get suited up, when the things they put on cotton surgical gloves, and then the glove itself has a rubber liner because it's got to be able to inflate, and the face of the palm of the glove is leather. So you got 3 layers that heat or feel has to come through. So it would have had to have been pretty hot or pretty cold for us to feel it, through the suit per se.
I saw an earlier video that you did. The heat did work for those long missions. You said you could heat up. You basically ate food out of a tube, right?
Yes. The men and women that fly today, the ones that take it into space, but also our U-2 pilots that are flying daily around the world, they have a pretty good menu to select from. Back in our day, we had 6 flavors. It was sloppy joes, beef and gravy, vanilla pudding, butterscotch pudding, applesauce, and peaches. I was never a big sloppy joes or beef and gravy, so I'd carry the fruit. And typically, if I was flying more than 5 hours, Tim, I would carry some food, because even though you had a physical before every flight, and then they fed you a high protein, low bulk meal, steak and eggs, you're really busy during a flight. So after about 5 hours, when I would be coming down from my next refueling, I would have a tube. It looks like a tube of toothpaste. It has a tube screwed into it, and on the right-hand side of your helmet, there's a valve, and that's where you drank water because you had to prevent yourself from becoming dehydrated because you're in a rubber-lined suit, and you're breathing 100% oxygen, which is dehydrating. So through that same access port, you could put that tube through, and then you squeeze the tube, and you get your meal because you can move your head inside the helmet. I took my grandson and granddaughter and 10 of their friends and some of their parents up to Beale Air Force Base in California summer before last so they could see the suiting up of a U-2. I mean, it's a spacesuit. This fellow was going up for 10 hours, and they came out, and they had a whole meal for him. I mean, in tubes that he was going to take aloft to feed himself during that extended time period, plus the water he was going to carry.
That was how appetizing. Yeah, it worked though.
Well, the new stuff was really pretty good. He had chicken cacciatore, he had key lime pie, he had some other stuff, and I just sat there. I said, I was just a generation too early.
And just ahead of the curve there, just a little bit there, Buzz. I'm going to take just a minute to remind our listeners that this is the Uncle Tim Show, Vintage Radio 107.7, WQUD, Erie Quad Cities. Any other funny stories you want to throw out there? I love the story of your wife seeing that plane leaking there on the runway.
One of the funny ones, we used to overfly Cuba about every 45 days. And so I had a Cuban overflight, and you wanted to pass over Cuba when the sun was at kind of a high position, between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock when the sun was highest. So that meant we left California, or we get up early in the morning and have our briefing and our physical and all this stuff. So, and to reduce noise from homes or stuff, we had bunk space down where our suits were that we could go down and sleep, and they'd get us up in the morning, and you'd have the breakfast. Well, I'd completed the mission, and I'm descending, and I've come into Mississippi. I have 2 tankers there going to refuel me so I can get back to California. And I get on the boom, because we could talk. It was the first setup where the outside world couldn't hear us, but we could talk to the tankers through that refueling pipe. It had a communication part to it also. And the tanker crew's all excited. Say, "Hey, Buzz, did you read the paper this morning?" I said, "Guys, I got up. We did the mission briefing." He said, "Wait." I said, "Why do I need to read the paper?" Well, you got to read it. You got to read Doonesbury. I said, "Why do I have to read Doonesbury?" He said, "Well, no, you really." I said, "Okay, guys, I know I'm going to land back in Beale before you are, but tell me, why do I have to read Doonesbury?" And they said, "You're going to love it. Today's cartoon in Doonesbury was Fidel Castro complaining about SR-71 overflights." And I said, "I'm going to have to cut that one out."
Yeah, I have to save that one. Buzz, you've done a lot of interviews. You're very good with the public. You're very giving. You work there at the museum. Is there a question that has never been asked that you wish somebody would have asked you? Or have they all been covered?
Well, one that gets rarely asked, I won't say has never been asked, but about the families. Because, when we were actually doing what we were doing, we couldn't share it. And it makes for an interesting, I couldn't tell you what a wonderful, loving, and supportive wife, because she knew that when time came, eventually I would talk about, but that there were lots of stuff that was going on that I really couldn't talk about. And they put the wives through a course to give them a sense of comfort that if anything did happen, there would immediately be Air Force and government people to help she and the family for whatever the occurrence and the consequence might be, which was important because, it was great flying the airplane, but I spent typically 150 days a year overseas because we flew most of our missions out of Okinawa, Japan, or Mildenhall, England. My last year, because of 2 of our pilots, it was really terrible. 2 of our pilots were out jogging, and this guy purposely ran them over with a car. So right away, instead of having 11 pilots, we were down to 9.
Wow!
And so that year, I was overseas 210 days, which was a little much. I could see the stress on the family. We could manage, because unlike with the military today, a lot of times they can't predict their TDYs as well. We had a flow pattern, and unless somebody got sick or something happened, you knew you were going to be in Japan for 6 weeks. You were supposed to come home for 3 months, go back for 6 weeks, come home. When you came back home, the 3 months at home, you may actually spend a month in England and then come back. So there was only 2 months at home, and then you went back to Japan. But it was fairly predictable, so you'd work your family activities and other things like that. But, I can't say enough. Now, I have 3 daughters. They grew up with in the SR program. I can share everything. That longest mission I flew, that 10 hours and 20 minutes, one of the really neat things, Tim, it's 8:20 in the morning. I'm landing back in Beale. I'm looking forward to getting out of the airplane and giving them back the suit. As I slowed the airplane down on the runway, the wing commander pulls out in front of me. And in the back window are 3 heads of 3 little girls and our daughters. So they were down at the airplane when I recovered. We tried to do family things to incorporate the family everywhere where we could. And that made the program really special because some of my closest friends now and I'm sure into the future were the men and women I served with in the SR-71 program because we knew what we had to do. We were really close-knit, and the camaraderie was unbelievable. And like when I came back from the Carter mission, there were 100+ people on the ramp there that we brought over specially for the mission. And the sense of satisfaction, not only among myself, because, the pilots and the navigators are the ones the public kind of sees, but all the maintenance, the film people, everything else, I mean, they were just cheering because the mission had been a success. I mean, we hadn't processed the film yet, but rarely did our cameras, fail. 95% of the time when we took off on operational missions, we collected, if the weather permitted. We couldn't always control the weather, but we collected what they were looking for.
Famous people that you've brushed shoulders with, got a few to mention?
I do. When I was a young captain, hadn't even started training, the Air Force Association asked me to come down to the AFA gathering that they used to have in November down in Los Angeles. It was kind of a space and other stuff. So I asked the squadron commander if I could go down. So I went down there, and there was a black tie dinner. And we're in our mess dress. There's 3 captains. I can't remember. One captain was from Space Center, and I think the other one's from Edwards. So we're sitting there. The dinner's over with, and we're just kind of chatting among ourselves. And Jimmy Doolittle comes up and says, "Boys, what are you doing?" Sir, or whatever. He said, "Come on, let's go to the bar."
Jimmy Doolittle.
Jimmy Doolittle took us to the bar for an hour and a half and talked to us about life and times, the Tokyo raid, his life and things. I mean, absolutely remarkable guy. And about 11:30, I think, somewhere around there, his wife kind of comes up and just looks up and says, "Jimmy?" And he stood up and looked at us. "Gentlemen, good evening."
Yeah, Jimmy was out of there. You met George Bush. You met Jimmy Doolittle.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. One of the black tie dinners we were at, Jimmy Stewart, the actor, Air Force General Officer.
Yeah,
he was the president of the mess. I mean, it was a great time to have been in the Air Force.
How many years did you spend in the SR program then?
6 years, 1975 to 1981.
And you retired from the Air Force what year?
In 1995.
95. And did you go to work at the Air and Space Museum right away?
No, because the museum didn't open until 2003.
Oh, I guess that would have been it pretty tough then.
Yeah. They started building it in the late 90s. One of the guys I flew with, Tom Allison, who was instrumental in working some of the restoration, a fellow SR pilot, a fellow SR instructor pilot, he got me interested. I was in the first class, and I'm the only SR pilot they have out there. But I have a wonderful time meeting the public, and I get to do special tours for the Smithsonian, which is most enjoyable. I took around Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor and her interns about a year ago. Very engaging lady. It was I was really delighted that I had the opportunity to do that. But I've been able to do many through these 15 years now. It seems hard to believe, but it's 15 years.
I've got to throw a big shout out to Stephen Paddock because without Steve, this interview wouldn't have happened. A pretty amazing and fun guy Steve is.
Yeah, he is. He's a delightful fellow docent to work with, and we've got 250 of us out there, and I would tell you, almost all of us really enjoy what we're doing.
So, how many days a week are you at the museum?
It averages about one.
Okay.
I'm there every other Saturday regularly, but then the special tours I do kind of fill in the blanks a little bit. Sometimes I'm out there twice a week, but I'd say most of the time I'm out there once a week.
People could spend a lot of time in there. I was just on an honor flight, and so we were taking in as much as we could. But I think that's the good museum. I mean, it's got the Discovery Shuttle in there.
Discovery Shuttle. It's got the Concorde. It's got the original 707 test bed. I mean, it just goes on. And we're going to have a stealth fighter there, a 117, probably within a couple of years. The Air Force has agreed to it, and the question is going to be how you're going to display it. But
hey, you got the you got the Enola Gay too.
Exactly right.
It just blew me away at what you've got in that museum, and you've got someone who flew that SR-71 that everybody gets to look at. Are there any Discovery
There are.
astronauts.
Tom Jones is, I think Tom did 4 missions on Discovery. He's remarkable. He was just inducted into the Space Hall of Fame down in Florida. So he's written 2 or 3 books, and he's a remarkable contributor to our efforts out there. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that comes to mind. I can't think of any, Tim, but I would encourage your viewers, if they Google me, Buz Carpenter, SR-71 pilot. There's videos out there. There's briefings I've given and things like that they might find interesting. And there's also a way to contact me if they have individual questions. And I try to get back with people as best I can. And I have a group of about, I'm not the end-all expert. I have a group of about 12 to 15, we call them graybeards. They're the old heads associated with this program, not only just military but civilians. And so when different museums, there's 30 museums that have blackbirds, and when people have questions, they seem to end up coming to the Smithsonian, and then when I see them, I field them out to the people that I know are the experts on it.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking all this time to spend with the listeners.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I wish you and each and every one of your listeners a very merry holidays, and I strongly encourage them to come back and visit us at the Smithsonian Air and Space Udvar-Hazy Center at Dulles Airport. We'd love to see them.
Well, I will definitely be in touch, and like I say, thanks again for spending so much time with us, and you'll be hearing from me. Thanks again, Buz.
You bet. My pleasure. Take care.
All right. Bye now. Wow. Don't know what to say after that.